We begin tonight with breaking news. The Obama campaign has asked Attorney General Michael Mukasey to order a special prosecutor to investigate whether the McCain campaign and the Bush administration's Justice Department are illegally working together to disseminate, quote, unsupported, spurious allegations of vote fraud. The aggressive move by the Obama campaign comes after a week in which the McCain camp and Republicans in Congress and the right-wing media have hammered away on the issue of potential voter registration fraud, particularly the role of the community group Acorn. The Bush administration has long been fixated with alleging voter fraud. Remember the U.S. attorneys getting fired scandal? Why did those U.S. attorneys get fired? Well, what's being investigated by a special prosecutor right now is if those attorneys were fired for resisting partisan pressure to bring voter fraud investigations and prosecutions in places where such actions would provide an excuse to suppress the vote, which would be really handy for beating Democrats in elections. The whole torture thing wasn't enough to hoist Alberto Gonzales out of office as Attorney General. It took the U.S. attorneys gin up the fake voter fraud scandal for us to see the south side of him. And now the outcome of another election may hinge as much on the aggressive practice of law as on the voters' view of the candidates. I hate this. Consider the rhetoric of the McCain campaign of late, as poll numbers drifted away from them. Chief strategist and Karl Rove protege Steve Schmidt told the New York Times today, quote, the scenario for winning for us is a narrow victory scenario. A narrow victory scenario? Pause to consider how Senator McCain might achieve a narrow victory. That might start with the lowest possible turnout by newly registered voters, an overwhelming majority of whom are Democrats in many places. That's the product of the legendary Obama ground game and the long contested Democratic primary. To keep turnout low, prevent votes from being counted, and scare voters into thinking there are massive voting shenanigans and that their vote won't count anyway. Start with wild, high-profile pronouncements like Senator McCain's extraordinary charge at the debate before more than 50 million Americans on Wednesday night.
We need to know the full extent of Senator Obama's relationship with Acorn, who is now on the verge of maybe perpetrating one of the greatest frauds in voter history in this country, maybe destroying the fabric of democracy.
Follow that up with McCain's campaign manager, Rick Davis, in a conference call today saying, quote, a cloud of suspicion seems to right now hang over this election. Over this election, as opposed to 2000 or 2004? And how about getting Sarah Palin in on the messaging? Here she was today.
I think voters are very concerned about voter fraud, and as more and more revelation comes in these 13 states that are now under investigation for potential voter fraud, I think that more American voters are becoming very, very concerned.
Those are the politics at work here. Now, are you ready for the truly scary stuff? The Associated Press sources two senior law enforcement officials speaking anonymously, saying that the FBI has launched a preliminary investigation into Acorn's voter registration activities. Why are they speaking anonymously? Because the AP notes Justice Department regulations forbid discussing ongoing investigations, particularly so close to an election. But they're leaking word anyway. Isn't this the same Justice Department from which those U.S. attorneys got fired for not towing the Republican line for alleging voter fraud? The Obama campaign's top lawyer responded today, writing Attorney General Mukasey, quote, I request that Special Prosecutor Dennehy's inquiry include a review of any involvement by Justice Department and White House officials in supporting the McCain-Palin campaign and the Republican National Committee's systematic development and dissemination of unsupported, spurious allegations of vote fraud. Obama campaign counsel Bob Bauer, the author of that letter, made his charge, this next charge, on Countdown in the last hour.
Less than 24 hours after John McCain thundered, as your opening showed, about vote fraud threatening the very fabric of our democracy, right thereafter, almost precisely as you would expect the Republican National Committee and the McCain-Palin campaign to plot it, lo and behold, senior department officials, admitting they were violating departmental policy, announced that an investigation of fraud was underway. This is an astonishing repeat of the kind of toxic intrusion of politics into the lawful administration of justice that we saw during the U.S. Attorney scandal. We're seeing a repeat of that.
The message? John McCain may not just be a clone of George Bush in terms of policy, but in earth-scorching politics as well. What exactly is at stake between the FBI Acorn investigation and the Obama campaign rejoinder? Time to call in Jonathan Turley, professor of constitutional law at George Washington University. Professor Turley, thanks for your time tonight. Hi, Rachel. I want to discuss some particular language with you from this challenge. In Bob Bauer's letter to Attorney General Mukasey, he writes this, quote, "It's highly likely that the very sort of politically motivated conduct identified in the department's investigation to date is repeating itself and for the same reason, unwarranted and politically motivated intervention in the upcoming election." What is your reaction to that allegation?
Well, there's no question that there seems to be a large airdrop of counsel in a lot of these states, and we certainly saw that in 2004 and 2006. And there is an uncanny similarity in terms of timing and also in terms of the specific states involved. I think that it is fair to say that some of these challenges do look like suppression efforts. For example, there's a reported effort in Michigan to challenge people whose homes have been foreclosed, and efforts to challenge people in Montana have change of addresses. Those are types of things that are classic suppression tactics. So I think that there is grounds really to be concerned here. Also, the fact is we have a special prosecutor who's looking into very similar facts. And if this was a bank fraud case as opposed to a voting fraud investigation, then the prosecutors would look for ongoing patterns. And I think that you have to fairly say that this is a pattern that should be looked into. I think it's true that there is a lot of similarities between what's happening just before this election and what's happened before the last two.
We know that the firing of the U.S. attorneys related to rejecting political pressure to pursue unfounded voter registration fraud cases. As you mentioned, that's what's being investigated by that special prosecutor. In terms of the way that special prosecutor investigations work, is it hard to expand their remit to include these current election allegations? Is that a decision that would have to be made by the Attorney General? Could the special prosecutor make that decision herself?
I actually think she could expand the investigation even without approval from Attorney General Mukasey. It's actually easier to do that with a special prosecutor than an independent counsel. But the similarities here are so close. What we're talking about is the possibility that what she is investigating from the last election was not an insular or historical event, but an ongoing criminal pattern. And it seems to me that any prosecutor could claim that as a legitimate extension of her investigation.
I am struck that in the Associated Press story about the FBI investigation of Acorn, the AP notes that the two sources who spoke to them from the Justice Department spoke on the condition of anonymity because of Department of Justice regulations that forbid discussing investigations like this, particularly so close to an election. Isn't part of what we learned about the U.S. Attorney scandal that they're not supposed to do stuff like this really close to an election at all, let alone comment on it to the AP?
Yeah, this is a very serious violation. Look, Washington literally floats on leaks, as you know. But this type of leak is very destructive. You know, when John McCain talks about tearing at the fabric of democracy, the greatest threat to democracy is even the appearance that the government itself is intervening in suppression tactics. That's a real Hugo Chavez moment. And if you're really concerned about the democratic process, then you have to be careful about these types of allegations. The other interesting thing is Republicans in 2000 were fighting for the right of state officials like Kathleen Harris to run their own shop, with the possibility that investigations could follow if there was illegality. And this now is the absolute inverse of that position. You saw with the Supreme Court turning back the Republican challenge. And I think in all fairness, I think many people should be concerned about this democratic process, but I'm much, much more concerned with the notion that the federal government is intervening yet again in the very same way that has been found to be abusive in the past.
George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Rachel.